So this is the lecture for Module 6, where we start to zoom in on Whitehead's process-relational Panexperientialism. The structure of this course is kind of like a spiral, and Whitehead's been our focus the whole time, but I tried to begin with a wider survey of the field of consciousness studies, which is really more than a single field. It's an interdisciplinary bonanza of sorts where, you've got people from neuroscience and psychology and anthropology and philosophy, computer science, like all trying to have a conversation with one another to discover a common language, first of all, to even define consciousness in the same way, and then to explain it, right? And so we started with this survey of consciousness studies, and we've been sort of spiraling inward closer and closer to an engagement directly with Whitehead's thought, and seeing how the problems raised by the study of consciousness are brought into sharper relief from the perspective of a process-relational philosophy, or a Panexperientialist philosophy, which is Whitehead's form of panpsychism, right? So we're spiraling into Whitehead, and we're kind of at the core now, and we're going to read a little bit of Whitehead's own writing from a book called Religion in the Making that he wrote in 1927, just before writing Process and Reality, which was his magnum opus a few years later. They began, Process and Reality was originally the Gifford Lectures, and this is the lecture series where William James gave his lecture on the varieties of religious experience, right, which later became a book of the same title. Whitehead gave Process and Reality at the University of Edinburgh, the Gifford Lectures, a few years after Religion in the Making. We read a chapter from this book, and all of Whitehead's books begin as lectures. It's, I think, important that there's always a sort of pedagogical performance at the base of Whitehead's writing. You see this in many philosophers. Like if you look at Fichte, all of the books we have that Fichte left us, the German idealist Johann Gottlieb Fichte, he died in like 1813, I think, around then. He wrote all of his books as like lecture performances where, he would be there to help his students grasp the meaning of his words, and it wasn't simply there on the page to be absorbed or assimilated. It needed to be transmitted, right? And so Whitehead's a difficult writer to understand, but if we keep in mind that his writing was originally spoken, and that he was there to dialogue with the students who heard him, who were exposed to his performance of these ideas. And I hope that, in dialogue with one another, when the inevitable perplexed confusions arise trying to make sense of what Whitehead is writing, I hope that we together can arrive at some interpretation that feels significant. And, every time I read, the reason I love Whitehead is that every time I read him, I perceive new connections, new aspects of reality, and my relationship to it are revealed to me every time I read him. It's never the same twice, which is exactly the main point of what he's trying to say. And it's almost as though, a book like Process and Reality needs to be approached as a ritual text that requires a certain, the performance of a certain, a spell almost on our part, or an invocation. Like we have to become adequate to the spirit in which the text was written. And so I hope you will accept my invitation into just this little slice of Whitehead's writing in a book on religion, actually. But I excerpted these pages from Religion in the Making because in trying to understand, the significance of human religion, Whitehead summarizes his whole metaphysical approach, which deals not just with religion, right, but with science and with ordinary everyday experience, human common sense. Whitehead is a thinker who's trying to hold together mysticism, religious and spiritual mysticism, scientific knowledge about nature, and our personal sort of autobiographical existence. He thinks that, we need to understand science and religion and art, and the nature of the human personality, that all of these things have to be dealt with in our metaphysical scheme, or our attempt to cosmologize, right? To study the universe and the patterns, the order that guides the universe's unfolding, to study all of that as a whole, and not to obscure its parts in the study of it as a whole, but to elucidate their behavior. And so, in this book, Whitehead gives us a sort of overview of all of the elements or ingredients at work in his philosophical system, right? He introduces us to his understanding of God as a dipolar process with a primordial and a consequent pole. He introduces us to eternal objects, which are kind of like Plato's forms, but for Whitehead, they're deficient in actuality. They don't actually do anything in and of themselves. For Plato, the forms were the most real things. They were the archetypal powers that birthed and maintained and destroyed the world. Whereas for Whitehead, these eternal objects are just pure possibilities awaiting actualization. And it takes actual occasions of experience to make these eternal objects real, to give them full existence. It's because it's actuality that acts, right? There's nothing real outside of the experience of some actual occasion of experience. And for Whitehead, God is one of these experiences, or experiencers, though hold that distinction lightly. We have to hold that distinction lightly when we're doing process philosophy. There's a divine experience, and there's creaturely, finite experience, like the experience of you and me, the experience of a photon, the experience of a frog, or a hippopotamus, or of a whale. These are each expressions of creativity. God is an expression of creativity. A beluga whale is an expression of creativity. And each one of these expressions of creativity is ingressing the realm of possibility, or actualizing, incarnating the realm of ideal forms, embodying them, expressing them, and feeling and being felt, right? So Whitehead's view of the universe, it has these ingredients, right? God, eternal objects, and actual occasions. And God is an actual occasion, but kind of a special one, minimally special, because Whitehead wants the same categories to apply across all scales in nature and reality. But God's special because God's experience is the reverse of everybody else's experience. Everybody else moves from a physical pole to a mental pole. The physical pole is primordial for creatures like you and me, but for God, the mental pole comes first, followed by the physical pole. For God, conceptual realization precedes physical realization, which is to say that God is the first feeler, the first to envisage the realm of ideal possibility and give it some character, a character of beauty and perfection, in fact. But that's only part of God's nature. God, in a way, orders the realm of eternal objects, but then the rest of us receive and interpret and decide on how to carry forward that initial actualization of possibility by God. We decide how to carry it forward. And God feels each one of our decisions and has to atone for it, atone for each one of them. God has to to realize the value of the universe again, despite all of our finite, sinful, wayward, and this is, I don't mean to use sinful to moralize, I'm just speaking in a language familiar to, Judeo-Christian, Islamic people of the book, so-called, that these religious traditions speak of sin as a kind of, a missing or a separating or of a kind of severing of one's own spirit from the life of the world, right? That's what sin means, as I understand it. And, Whitehead, I think, is inviting us into a more participatory relationship with God and with the world, and inviting us into a reconnection of our own spirit, where by spirit, in the Western philosophical tradition, spirit is what Descartes meant by the thinking substance. Spirit is the intellect. Spirit is that which is definitely not body, right? For Descartes. And in Kant, what is spirit? It's the transcendental ego, right? The transcendental unity of apperception, if you want to get really fancy about it. And this philosophical understanding of spirit as something totally separate from body, from matter, that dualism is really the core, the essence of modern consciousness. Consciousness becomes a problem because of, and again, I'm speaking symbolically because of the archetypal significance of this term for the tradition that I know, and I think most of us probably are embedded within, the Judeo-Christian or Western context. Sin, consciousness, it's the severing of conscience from community, individual, private, moral responsibility, the separation, the isolation of that from any sense of a network of relationship or a matrix of shared responsibility. And this has, epistemological implications, right? And this is what Anderson Weeks was describing in the first essay of his that we read, or the first chapter from the book that he edits, Process Approaches to Consciousness, where, he talks about how conscience and consciousness kind of separated, and how there was a privatization which occurred, and the imagining of consciousness as a count noun, that like each of us is a consciousness, but at the same time we have consciousness and we are conscious of things, and so it becomes a muddle at that point. But there's a way in which what Whitehead is trying to do is to bring a little bit more grace into our philosophy, to absolve us for the sin of separating spirit from matter. And I think it's important to understand that this is the problem Whitehead is trying to solve. He's trying to break us free of that modern metaphysical prison wherein minds are separated from bodies, wherein minds are separated from one another, and wherein minds are separated from God. Whitehead wants to break us free of that metaphysical prison to invite us into a new kind of universe. And his philosophy is an attempt to describe a new kind of universe. We're sure we can still talk about minds and bodies and God, but we have to talk about them as members of a community, as organs in an organism, or maybe better, organisms in an ecology, right? We're all part of a spiritual and natural ecology. And, somehow there is a circulation of spirit and nature. I think that intuition is at the core of all of the, world's deep wisdom traditions and esoteric knowledges. There's a circulation of spirit and matter, of God and nature. And Whitehead is inheriting this stream of thought, this lineage, where metaphysics is the effort to describe reality, the process of reality, such that we no longer think or feel as though spirit, as though our own sense of autonomy as individual conscious agents, as though that were somehow separate from our social relationships with other humans, with the natural world around us. How can we come to think and feel those relationships differently? Not as minds separate from bodies, minds separate from other minds, and minds separate from God, right? That's the disenchanted horror show that Whitehead's trying to recompose. For Whitehead, God is the poet of the world, and in trying to give voice to God's nature, Whitehead is trying to direct a new show. He's trying to paint a new picture. He's trying to give us roles in a new kind of drama, a cosmogonic drama, where we are participants with God and with all the other creatures in this universe in the further flowering of possibility, in the realization of ideals. That's what the universe does, and that's what we are here to do. This is Whitehead's invitation. So I want to dwell for the remainder of this lecture on Whitehead's understanding of the nature of perception. In the 2 chapters from Process Approaches to Consciousness that we read, there's a comparison made between James's radical empiricism and Whitehead's understanding of perception. And Whitehead's very critical of the way that modern philosophers have, on the one hand, centered consciousness, and on the other hand, the way that modern philosophy has argued or construed epistemology as if consciousness has access to the world, to the external world, primarily through the outward-facing senses, the eyes, the ears, and so on. Whitehead thinks that the raw or primal data that we receive from the world around us is not through sense perception. He thinks sense perception of the extended world is in fact a derivative form of perception, that it is secondary, and that the more primordial mode of perception has been ignored, covered over by the consciousness-centered philosophy of the modern period. This more primordial mode of perception, Whitehead calls perception in the mode of causal efficacy. It's a form of bodily perception. He also calls it sense reception rather than sense perception. So Whitehead has a really brilliant analysis of the philosopher David Hume. Hume was famous, among other things, for denying that we have any sense impression or sense experience of causality. All we perceive in the external world are these constant conjunctions between two events, and there's no necessary connection, Hume says. At least we don't perceive necessary connection. And in science, in order to come up with a mechanical model for how nature operates, necessary connection or causality is essential, right? But Hume is saying, no, we don't really perceive that, and so if we're going to be strictly empirical, there's no evidence of causality. Now, Whitehead looks at Hume's analysis and says, wait a minute, Hume, you're saying that we see with our eyes, and that this withness of the body, this recognition that the eyes function as a kind of medium conveying what's going on beyond our body to our own nervous system, and presumably to a mind that is somehow resident in that nervous system, you're talking about the eyes acting as a medium, and that itself is already a form of causality. There is a causal efficacy at work in the that allows us to see with our eyes, right? Or to feel with our hands, or to hear with our ears, right? And so Whitehead wants to say that it's very easy for us as conscious, rational human beings to ignore the fact that the body plays such a central role as a medium, allowing us to feel the causal vectors of energy flowing in from our environment. It's very easy to miss this, and it's right there in Hume's writing, but he himself misses it. And so Whitehead opposes the mode of perception called causal efficacy, right, which is our feeling of the emotional vectors streaming in from our environment. He opposes that mode, which he thinks is more primordial, to the mode of perception called presentational immediacy, which is what philosophers from Descartes through Hume and Kant have tended to dwell upon. Perception in the mode of presentational immediacy is perception through the senses of the external world, and vision is the paradigmatic sense here. It's perception of the external world as it exists here and now. It's three-dimensional, it's immediate, but for Whitehead, this is a derivative mode of perceiving the world that is constructed by our sensory organs and by our sophisticated nervous system. It's a construction, and that what's primary is this mode of causal efficacy, which itself is not a clear and distinct mode of perception. Causal efficacy is more vague, right? It's more about gut feelings, right? It's more about these moods and these vaguer emotional states that, like, you walk into a room and before you even see the expression on people's faces, you can feel that, oh, there's anger present here, or it doesn't feel quite right, you know? Causal efficacy is, think of it as like when you walk into a dark room and you flick the light switch on and your eyes blink immediately. Causal efficacy is what causes your eyes to blink, right? It's the feeling of our sensory organs themselves rather than our sensory organs functioning transparently as mediums to reveal something beyond themselves. So Whitehead says if we turn our attention towards causal efficacy, we're actually getting more insight into the nature of nature, that is, into the nature of physical processes, than when we're stuck in this mode of presentational immediacy. When we're perceiving through the mode of presentational immediacy, the world around us, the world apprehended by consciousness in that mode, is such that, you know, it's arrayed as a series of clear and distinct objects. And as Weeks puts it, consciousness perceiving the world in that way through sense perception it looks at nature as a collection of objects, and it cannot find any way that collection of objects could provide the conditions necessary for consciousness to emerge, right? So consciousness looks out at a world through the senses, sees a bunch of objects. It sees what Spinoza would call nature natured, or in Latin, natura naturata, right? It's not a dynamic, processual, creative nature. Consciousness perceives nature natured, nature as a collection of objects. And Whitehead's process philosophy is predicated upon this return to the more primordial mode of perception, of causal efficacy, of bodily feeling, and then looking again and saying, oh, nature is a process of inheritance of feeling from the past and of a projection of that feeling into the future. Nature is this pulsating process. It's, in Spinoza's terms, natura naturans, nature naturing, right? And it's only by looking at our own bodily feeling through the mode of perception called causal efficacy that we gain insight into what's going on beneath the surface of the objects that appear to consciousness, right? It's getting beneath the surface through our own most primordial mode of experience that Whitehead thinks allows us to grasp how consciousness can be the fruition of physical processes. So to just reiterate the point, modern philosophy is consciousness-centric, right? It puts human consciousness at the center, and epistemology becomes first philosophy in the sense that the major problem for philosophy is how to account for consciousness's knowledge of the external world. David Hume makes this a problem because he denies causality, right? And natural science depends upon our ability to understand the causal relationships at work in nature. Kant realizes that we need causality to have science, right? Science seems to work really well. And so what does Kant do in response to Hume? Well, he says, okay, Hume, we don't have any sensory or empirical evidence of causation because causation is an idea. Kant says causation is an idea that we have no choice but to apply to our cognition of nature and to our experience of nature. So Kant says, with an agreement with Hume, we don't experience causation through our senses. Rather, causation is one of the ideas or the categories through which our experience of the world is constructed, and so that we cannot experience the world without causality, according to Kant. So causation becomes an idea. Now, recall that when we, in the first module, read about the progression of thought through the German idealists, that Schelling reverses the Kantian picture, and instead of asking what must consciousness be or what must the mind be such that nature can appear in the way that it does, right? That's Kant's question. He puts mind at the center and asks how mind is able to construct an apparent nature. Schelling inverts this picture and says, what must nature be? Not apparent nature, but real nature. What must real nature be such that mind is possible, such that mind could emerge out of it? And that's precisely what Whitehead does. And so for Whitehead, instead of saying causality is an idea that we project onto our sensory experience of nature, of necessity, Whitehead says causality is the most basic, fundamental form of experience that we have. So for Whitehead, consciousness is displaced from the center of philosophy. Consciousness becomes rare and peripheral in Whitehead's universe. Consciousness is something that highly evolved animals and human beings have. It is not something that pervades the universe. A non-conscious form of experience or feeling pervades the universe. And that very basic form of feeling, which is just the inheritance of the past, the repetition of the past, that's causality for Whitehead. So for Whitehead, feeling and causation become synonymous, right? And so causation is not an idea. It is the most real thing that we experience. We experience it in our bodies. A stomach ache, right, is evidence of the reality of causal vectors in nature, right? The blinking of our eye when we flick the light switch on is evidence of causality in nature. And so, connecting back to the German idealists that we briefly studied in Module 1, we can see how Whitehead is inverting Kant in the same way that Schelling did, right? And what this leads to is a picture of nature not as nature observed by an already pre-existing consciousness, right? It is nature participated in as a growing, developing, living process where consciousness is an emergent expression of nature rather than a spectator who is standing outside of nature, right? All the modern philosophers, they put consciousness at the center as something separate from nature, as something separate from the physical world, right? That's the framework that all the modern philosophers are working on, whether they are rationalists or empiricists, whether they are materialists or idealists. They're centering consciousness, and they're saying it's just something different from nature. Whitehead is saying consciousness is a flowering of physical processes. And he's asking us to look at nature not as it appears to our consciousness. He's asking us to look at nature as it is felt in our own bodies, right? So you could say Whitehead is, and he in fact does say, his philosophy is an attempt at a critique of pure feeling, which replaces Kant's critique of pure reason, right? Because for Whitehead, we don't start with consciousness and then try to derive the external world. We start with bodily feeling. And by feeling our own bodies from the inside out, we have an analogy to understand. We can understand by analogy, rather, what the inside of nature is like.